That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd Johns Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd Johns Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd Johns Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd Johns Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. All right, it is That's Enough Out of You, and I am the main host, Bill Rader. And I am with the other host of this podcast, Sean Kane. How's it going, big fella?
Doing good, Billy. Billy Raids, the big man and the biggest hill in Archibald.
The biggest hill, but you know what happens to guys on big hills?
They roll down.
Well, I didn't want to go there, buddy.
All right, so we have a very special guest with us today. He is a good friend of ours and actually one of our Patreons. And he goes by Big Ange, Angelo Mariucci. Ange, what's going on, buddy?
How we doing, guys? Happy Father's Day.
Yeah, happy Father's Day.
Thanks. Same to you. How you doing, Big Ange?
Thank you. Doing well. Nice full day. Made some stuff on the grill, went swimming, froze. Still waiting for certain unmentioned things to go back to where they should be. It was not pleasant in the water.
I hear you, buddy.
Yeah, we've only been able to use our pool like once this year. It's
crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Not been a great summer so far for pool, but of course, by the time this episode drops, we'll probably be in like the 90s. So
all right.
Hopefully, Billy. Hopefully. So before we get started, guys, I want to mention we have a new Patreon, Scott Alfieri from California. We want to thank Scott, and he's just, he's been a longtime follower of us. I don't know if he was right from the beginning, but pretty close to when we started this thing. And he comments just about every episode, and he's really one of our biggest listeners. So glad to have him on Patreon. I just put up some premium intel on there, so a lot of good stories on there that you're not going to hear on our website or on the podcast, Billy.
Yeah, definitely a good idea to join Patreon. Thanks, Scott. We appreciate your support. Scott's he's been commenting on some of my posts lately too. In fact, he was commenting on one today that I put on there about RFK Jr. And there was a woman, one of my Facebook friends, former work associate of mine, and she kind of laid into him, and I messaged him. I said, hey, probably good idea to avoid getting into it with this lady. I don't know if she's on the stable side. So
he's a big supporter of RFK Jr. So
yeah,
great to have him on board. And he put in a great question. So the next question episode, his will be the first one, and it's really good. It's about Castellano in the mob. So we'll get to that in the next question episode.
All right. Sounds good. We got a good episode today, though. A lot of good topic today.
Well, we're going to talk about pro wrestling. We're going to talk specifically about the Monday Night Wars. But let's start it off. Big Ange, I want you to tell the story of I believe it was 1996 down at Tanks and Scranton.
Yeah.
I believe it was me, you, my brother Jamie. And is that it, Ange, or was Marty and Mike Kane or Pilchy with us?
I think Pilchy was with us.
Okay.
I'm almost positive Pilchy was with us. But I mean, we used to go down to the CYC shows, the Scranton CYC. I mean, that's where, I mean, before the arena and stuff, I mean, that's basically, that was our basically where we went to be able to see like wrestling live. I mean, we didn't really have, unless you were going to go down to like the Spectrum or, Madison Square Garden or something. But we went down there, and after the matches, we went down to Tinks. And we went for whatever reason, because I wasn't a big fan of the dance club part of it, but we went up there for whatever reason, and we saw primetime Brian Lee drinking at the bar, and was wrestling in WWE as Chains at the time as part of Disciples of the Apocalypse, which was affiliated with The Undertaker. And we badgered that poor guy, the nicest guy ever. I mean,
great guy.
I think we talked to him for, I think it was like, we had him cornered up there for like 2 hours.
At least 2 hours, Ange, at least.
And we'll talk about everything from, I was always fascinated. Like once when that Sports Illustrated article broke in the 80s that wrestling was fake, and not fake, but scripted. The backstage side of it always fascinated me. And I always try to learn and read as much as I could, about different things. So telling us about like the different things backstage and pranks, that they would play on each other. And I remember like asking him, I was like, oh, like everybody ribs each other backstage. He goes, yeah, like the only person nobody messes with Ken Shamrock. Everybody's afraid of him. But I remember asking him about, specific, because I like at that point I think everybody thought the Montreal Screwjob was just a work, and I remember asking him about that, and he's like, no, and this was before the that documentary about like it was the Wrestling with the Shadows came out,
the Bret Hart
and he basically everything that they covered in that, he talked about, no, I was legitimate. I was there. He goes, I was back there in Bret's locker room, and Bret came out, and Vince tried it. Like Undertaker was furious, was banging on the door because Vince locked himself in his office, and Vince said, hey, you need to go talk to him now. And Vince went in there to try to apologize. He goes to try to explain his situation, and Bret said, hey, I'm going to take a shower. If I come back out here and you're still here, I'm knocking you out. Vince didn't leave. Bret came out. Bret knocked him out.
So, Ange, this had to be later than 96 then, because the Montreal Screwjob was 97, right? So
I want to say it was maybe like 6 or 7 months before the documentary came out.
Okay.
It was about 6 or 7 months before the documentary came out. Cause then I remember watching the documentary and I was like, ooh, he was right.
No, Ange, you remember that other guy that was with Brian Lee, that guy that was just totally jacked, probably taking everything in every drug in the book.
It might have been one of the Harris twins.
Man, was he jacked.
The other guy. Yeah. Well, it's like he was such a nice guy, though. I mean, he because a lot of times they go out there, they just want to, relax, unwind, let out some steam. He was so cool, though. I mean, like talk to us for at least 2 hours.
At least. Yeah, he was fantastic.
Great night. I mean, CYC, I missed that. I mean, it was fun. I remember watching wrestling on TV. The ring looks so huge, but the CYC is not. It's like basically a high school gym.
Yeah,
I remember the ring being so smaller compared to the TV. When you see it on the live TV tapings.
Right.
Yeah, I remember going down there.
We used to go there all the time. My dad used to take us down.
God, it was great.
And the one time, I remember we were like walking down the hall. I think I forget. We got like popcorn or something. You used to get those boxes of popcorn, the little orange drink. Remember the orange drink?
Yeah.
We used to throw the cartons of orange drink in
there.
Yeah. But we got that, and we're walking down the hall, and all of a sudden I we like bump into this guy, and I look up and I look up and I keep looking up and up and up, and it's Don Morocco.
Oh my
It's
God.
magnificent Morocco. My dad's like, all right, let's keep going. It's like, oh my
I remember I saw Andre down there, and seeing
Yeah, me
Andre
too. When I was a kid,
walking out through the crowd, you
Massive.
really
Yeah.
you don't appreciate like until you see him live, you don't appreciate how big he was. I mean,
was
people a lot of
humongous.
remember him from like, you know, when he retired. I mean, he had a lot of injuries, like, and just like, you know, with his disease, which made him so tall. He had a lot of problems with his spine and stuff where he started shrinking a little bit. But I mean, you see him in his prime walking out, it was like, you know, me walking amongst like kindergarten kids. I mean, he just like loomed head and shoulders by far among the crowd.
And there's some stories too of stuff that happened at the CYC. I remember there was one incident where Paul Orndorff punched a guy.
Oh, I remember that.
yeah,
That made the news.
Yeah. And then the other thing, the other thing was, I think it was, so if you guys remember when Iron Sheik and Hacksaw Jim Duggan got arrested.
right.
Yeah.
I think they were either going to or coming from the CYC. They were driving on Route 80. So it was either like they were coming from the CYC going to Jersey, or it was the other way around.
Yeah.
But I do remember this kid that I knew got to go backstage, and he saw those two playing cards with each other. And this was before that happened. And I talked to him the next day at school. He's like, so Jim Duggan and Iron Sheik are friends. I'm like, really? He's like,
I remember that. And even after they got arrested, I remember it's got to be fake. See, like they're riding in the car together.
Yeah.
But it's like, it was like finding out wrestling wasn't real. It was like, you know, finding out like certain things aren't real. Or I gonna watch what I gotta. I'm saying
be careful
here,
there, Ange.
But it's like when you find out that it's like, you know, scripted, and I mean, it was just like, what?
Yeah.
But I still, you know, became really fascinated by it. I mean, and when you talk about the Monday Night Wars, I think that's really where you got to understand how wrestling was back then, because prior to like Vince McMahon taking over in the early 80s, I mean, the wrestling scene was very like split into territories. And there's a really good documentary on, I believe it's Access. It's called, or maybe TNT. I can't remember which channel it's on, but it's by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's production company. It's called The Territory Years, and really that's what it was about. They taught, like, it was like wrestling back then. It was all territories. Like the WWE was the Northeast,
right?
The NWA was like, you know, the southern part and Southwest. The AWA was the area, states around Minnesota, and I mean, the unwritten rule, the gentleman's agreement is basically you stayed in your own backyard, meaning you don't promote outside of your territory. And like back then, I mean, it probably would have been a really cool thing to, like, you know, be able to like remember wrestling at that point, you know, but you know, you had a lot of champion versus champion matches. Like I remember Bob Backlund wrestled Harley Race when he was the NWA champion at one point. He wrestled Nick Bockwinkel when he was a champion at one point. Dusty Rhodes wrestled for the WWE title against superstar Billy Graham. Like a lot of talent was lent out to other promotions. Like, you know, Andre the Giant wrestled everywhere. He wrestled for the AWA. He wrestled for the NWA, Japan. Yeah, world class. And Vince McMahon purchased the WWE from his father, WWF, it was known back then, from his father in 1982. And, you know, basically, he said, you know what, he was basically the renegade at that point. He's like, you know what, he had a vision for WWE. He wanted to take it national. He wasn't going to go by the unwritten rules of, prior with his father and the other promoters. And a really funny story was Bill Watts, he owned Mid-South Wrestling. and Jim Ross was a young announcer at that point, and he really wanted to learn the business. So the different promoters had a behind doors closed meeting on what about Vince McMahon and what they were going to do and about him. And it was, kind of mafia-ish type stuff they talked about. But Jim Ross was telling the story in the one episode of the territory years. He's like, I went to the bathroom, I'm in the stall, taking care of business. Two of the promoters that were there at the meeting came in, and one guy goes, you know what, I know a guy, and we could take him out. And Jim Ross he's like, I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I've lifted my feet up in the stall and I'm afraid to move. I didn't want anybody to know I'm there. I mean, that's how bad it was.
Wow.
And then Vince McMahon, he went in and he signed up a lot of the talent from these other territories, like taking them away, like Randy Savage, Bret Hart from Calgary Stampede, Roddy Piper, and most notably Hulk Hogan from the AWA, who was popular. He was a popular wrestler at the point, but for whatever reason, Verne Gagne was not going to put the AWA title on him, and Vince signed him. And there's another funny story there. Like when Hulk Hogan told him he was signing with WWE, Verne Gagne thought he was goofing around, didn't think he was serious. And then 2 days later, he no-showed an event, and he realized that Hulk Hogan really did sign with WWE. And Iron Sheik, who was wrestling at that point, Iron Sheik said Verne Gagne was going to pay him to break Hogan's legs. And but Hogan, basically was going to be the cornerstone of what Vince McMahon was trying to do. And even like when you look at, because Hogan was seen to the kids as a superhero.
Right.
I mean, saying your prayers, taking your vitamins, training, and the marketing that they put behind Hogan, which eventually would go to the other wrestlers as well. Because you really didn't see a lot of wrestlers when they prior to Hogan, really didn't see a lot of wrestlers with the T-shirts and the merchandise and things like that. I mean, not really. But it just exploded, and WWE took off, and they really just took off on a national level to where the other, promotions really couldn't compete with them, and lost a lot of their wrestlers to them.
And let me ask you a question. When you were talking Verne Gagne, do you think one of the reasons he didn't give Hogan the title in the AWA is that, Verne was a tactician, his background, he was more of a technical wrestler, and let's face it, Hogan's not he's not known for his technical skills. He was a mic skills with the mic, and he was the flash that was to come in the future. So do you think that was the reason that Verne never gave him the title?
Well, Hulk Hogan was the original John Cena with the 5 moves of doom. I mean, really, it was punches, leg drops, and
which was
really wasn't a lot of I don't know though, because
from what I remember, I saw there's been a lot of documentaries about the rise and fall of the AWA, and I think Eric Bischoff talked a lot about this too, because he worked for the AWA. I think the issue was Hogan didn't have a contract with the AWA. His contract had expired, and Verne didn't know if he was going to resign, so he wouldn't put the belt on him until he resigned. And then eventually, Hogan just decided, well, I'm going to go with McMahon.
Well, the thing with that though too is Hulk Hogan did beat Nick Bockwinkel for the AWA World Title and actually had the belt for about a week. But during the match, this is how funny it is though. I don't even think they threw each other over the top rope, but at one point they threw each other through the middle rope to the floor. And a week later, they took the belt off of Hogan. They threw each other to the floor. So therefore, it's a double disqualification. The belt goes back to Nick Bockwinkel. That's right. Yep. It's just like I don't know. I think I think if he put the belt, or he knew he was going to put the belt on him, I think he would have signed a contract to stay there. But I think, like I said, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe some of it had to do with what Sean was saying, or because I mean, when it comes down to it, though, it's about, people that put the butts in the seats and the popularity. And Hogan was really big back then. But like I said, I honestly don't know. I mean, looking back on it, I think Verne Gagne probably regretted it when he saw what Hogan morphed into, and the fact that Rocky III probably really helped him out.
Right. Well, Rocky III didn't even come out until after he jumped to the WWF. That was had that happened prior, I think Verne would have, he would have realized what he had, and he would have signed Hogan, up probably, to a multi-year contract, which didn't exist back then. But from what I understood, he was hesitant to pull the trigger on a contract. And then Hogan just said, screw this. I'm just going to go with Vince, and Vince promised me a boatload of money, and he's going to make me a big star. And
it worked. Yep. I mean, because they really took off, and then which eventually would lead to WWE in it was 1993, I believe, January 11th, 1993. That's when Monday Night Raw debuted, and that was like really the first. I think WWE had it was more of a talk show, primetime show. I think it was on USA. It was like almost like a Johnny Carson type talk show, but not really like any wrestling. It was the first actual primetime that I know of, like, wrestling program, which eventually would be, because really for wrestling fans, really the only thing, because really pay-per-views were all done on closed circuit, and it was really only WrestleMania they showed. So unless you went to see a really big card, you would either have to go to the show, or really your only tie into it was Saturday mornings, which eventually Rock killed the Saturday morning product for WWE. They did away with it entirely eventually. But really that was the first like primetime wrestling show that I know of.
Well, the one I remember, Ange, was the one that they had on Monday nights with Bobby Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon in the studio, and they would show the match. I don't know if you remember that. They'd
vaguely
come back to them, and they'd show a match. It was usually at Maple Leaf Gardens or Madison Square Garden. And they weren't the best matches. It was like SD Jones against whatever, Killer Khan, but they weren't the best matches, but I do remember that show. And
then they had those specials. Remember, they had those specials on Saturday night,
right?
Saturday was after
event. That was after awesome. Hogan, though, right after Hogan won the belt.
Right. They had Saturday night's main event,
like mid to late 80s, I think, is when Saturday Night Main Event like started.
And then they had one that I think was just called the Main Event.
But it really took. And like I said, the other promotions really couldn't compete, especially the smaller promotions, like right. like the Tennessee Jerry Lawlers, which would later become USWA. World Class. They couldn't compete because they would Vince would sign up all their wrestlers, and they would lose them. The World Class lost Fritz von Erich's son, Kerry Von Erich, to WWE. Right. It's just it was something like it just really, and it's kind of ironic that later, and we'll get to that later in the podcast, how Vince had the tables turned where now he's in the other position and seeing his guys taken away. But that leads us with WCW. WCW, which was Jim Crockett Promotions, came from the NWA. The NWA was I think it was 13 regional territories that formed. I think it was Mid-South, the Mid-Atlantic, Georgia, Florida, World Class, like a bunch of the other territories.
Right.
And in 1988, Ted Turner purchased WCW from Jim Crockett Promotions, and they left the NWA and formed their own organization, which basically pretty much, the NWA is still around as more of an independent organization now, but it basically killed off, because really the NWA was one of the big three until WCW left, because all the wrestlers associated with the NWA, like Flair, the Horsemen, Dusty Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, Luger, like the Rock and Roll Express, they all went with WCW.
Right.
And it basically killed the NWA. But they, in 1991, I believe it was, Ted Turner hires Eric Bischoff to lead, WCW, to take control. And I think Jim Ross really thought it would have went to him, but he chose Eric Bischoff, which then Jim Ross went to WWE to be an announcer and have a backstage role there.
But I don't think it was 91. I think it was a little bit later than that.
92, maybe?
I think Bill Watts was running WCW. And then there was a controversy with him saying ridiculously racist and horrible things.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Yeah.
And then they got rid of him. And that's when, now I don't think it happened right away. But he did tag Bischoff as, now Bischoff, he didn't pick him right away to run WCW. I think he was, I forget the title they gave him initially, but it wasn't the, what he ended up with, which was, I think, president or executive vice president, whatever it was. But, he did pick Bischoff out of a crowd, and Bischoff ended up, good friends with Ted Turner. He would actually go to Ted's office, and they would sit there and talk about the business. But yeah, absolutely.
But WCW, while it wasn't at WWE's level or be like really even competing with them, they were doing all right. They were doing better than any other promotion that was out there, because they started all one by one. They all started, going under. But Eric Bischoff tells this story. There's a really good documentary on A&E about the NWO, and there's one on the Monday Night Wars. And Bischoff, said that really, we weren't making money, we were losing money. But Ted Turner was a big wrestling fan, and he supported WCW. Really, he was the only one that supported it. But even he came up at one point and said, hey, you got a year to turn this around, or I'm pulling the plug on this myself. So that's where, Eric Bischoff, and I believe it was through Ric Flair, because Hulk Hogan, like early 90s, Vince McMahon doesn't think that Hogan is the draw that he is anymore. And he's really trying to go on a youth movement, like wrestlers like Bret Hart, building up Shawn Michaels, and trying to get a lot of younger talent, which what they call, I think they called it the new generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's also not forget that, the steroid issues.
Oh yeah.
He was trying to shift away from the, these big, comic book like guys. And
well, even if you remember, Hogan disappeared for a while.
Right.
Like he disappeared for a good while.
Yep.
And when he came, it was the WrestleMania match when he came back with when Bret Hart was wrestling Yokozuna, and they put the belt on him. Like Bret Hart lost the belt to Yokozuna, and then Hulk Hogan came down, and Bret said, "Oh, go get him!" So, defend the honor of the United States. Hogan won it in like 13 seconds, but really the relationship, and I think largely part of the steroid, because Hogan testified against Vince McMahon. And I think Vince was really hurt by that. And just like their relationship really wasn't on the best of terms, they basically, Hogan thought he had gas left in the tank. He had a good run left. Vince McMahon didn't think so. So they agreed to part ways. And I think, though, honestly, I don't think Vince ever thought that Hogan would go anywhere else. I really don't. I think he figured, okay, he's doing his movie thing now. He's got his TV show, Thunder in Paradise. And I really don't think he thought that he would ever compete against Vince or go somewhere else. But Ric Flair reached out to Hogan, trying to get him to WCW. Vince, he was kind of unsure, but, Hogan came there and said, all right, and Hogan, I think, realized too that WCW wasn't in the same neighborhood as WWE, but he goes, hey, we'll give it a shot. After a year, if this ain't doing well, I'm out. And that's where Randy Savage comes in, which also helped WCW, because Randy Savage is in the same position as Hogan. If you remember, he made, when Raw debuted, Randy Savage was one of the announcers. And he wanted to still wrestle, and Vince McMahon said, nope, you know what, we're going with the youth movement, you're announcing. So Randy Savage reached out to Hogan. Next thing you know, Randy Savage is in WCW. And what that helped WCW was now you have so many dream matches that, like, you know, people that followed wrestling in the 80s, you had Randy Savage, you could wrestle like Sting, and, you know, you could have Hogan wrestling Sting, and finally have a decent like Flair and Hogan, because when Flair came to WWE, and I think it was 90, 91, I don't even think they had a WrestleMania match. I mean, it was like the matches were always like goofy, like it would be like a double count out, or it was never anything like definitive. And they were supposed to have a WrestleMania match, but then I think it was Hogan backed out.
You're talking about Flair and Hogan. Yeah. I actually saw one of their matches at the Spectrum. My friend and I went down to Philly and saw that. And what was funny, we were sitting right on an aisle seat on the floor, and Flair and Hogan were right next to us punching each other. Like we could have just reached out and touched either one of them. It was great.
Yeah, and then WCW started signing up because Vince McMahon started to let a lot of the wrestlers and tag teams that, like, from the 80s go, like the Nasty Boys ended up coming to WCW. Hacksaw Jim Duggan ended up coming to WCW. So, I mean, Vince at this point starts to realize, you know, okay, I might have a little bit of competition here. If you remember, that's when they started doing the Huckster and the Nacho Man vignettes, and like making them say, oh, they're older, we have the younger talent. And so, I mean, WCW started, you know, to like make some waves. And at this point, though, Ted Turner comes up to Eric Bischoff, because Ted Turner is a businessman and he like competition, and he wants to, you know, see how he can fare against Vince McMahon. He goes to Eric Bischoff and says, hey, you know, what do we have to do to compete with Vince? And Eric Bischoff, like in a really good doc, that going back to the Monday Night Wars documentary, Eric Bischoff doesn't know what to say. I mean, but he knows he has to say something. And he goes, I'm sitting there. I'm like, what do I say? I have to say something. What do I say? And he's like, give me 2 hours on Monday night. Thinking there's no way. He goes, I'm thinking there's no way he's going to agree to this. And he said, to his surprise, though, Ted Turner pauses for a second. He goes, okay, you got 2 hours on Monday night on TBS.
Yeah.
So now, like, Eric's like, okay, like, now what? So he's doing looking around and going like to like where he's looking, he knows he's got to bring in some young, fresh talent, some young blood. And he looks over at WWE, and WWE, like I said, they're struggling too, because they're coming off, they're losing wrestlers like Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, and they're trying to build up these new stars. But I mean, they're having some decent success, like The Undertaker, where before he's more like, I wouldn't say like to term like Stephanie McMahon and Triple H's term an A+ player. He evolves into one of the main guys, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and two former WCW mid-card cast-off that Vince built up, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. And he's looking at these guys, and Scott Hall is coming close to the end of his contract, and he wants to, go to the next level. And, he wants to make more money. So, but him and Vince can't come up on a deal. So Eric Bischoff, I don't know if he contacted Eric Bischoff or Eric Bischoff contacted him. Eric Bischoff makes him a huge contract offer for a lot less days, because back then, like, you talk to any of those guys from the WWE back then, Bret Hart or Undertaker, they're on the road 300 nights a year, if not more. They might see their family or friends or kids or whatever. They might see them like 1 or 2 days, like a month. And so he's ready to go. But before that, he talks to Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash sees the contract and his eyes bug out. But at the same time, though, Kevin Nash is a little bit more apprehensive. He doesn't want to go. But at the same time, I mean, you're talking a lot of money for a lot less days. And both Scott Hall and Kevin Nash said, you could have made that money with WWE, but you were going to be working a good 95% of the year.
Right. The other big difference is, Ange, that the money was guaranteed.
Yeah.
And
And Vince wasn't going to do that.
Right.
Yeah. But
So
Kevin Nash goes to Vince McMahon and says, look, match the deal, I'll stay. And Vince says, look, I can't. He goes, I can't guarantee the money. I can't do it for less days. I mean, if I do it for you, I got to do it for everybody. So that's when, Kevin Nash jumped ship. And that leads to it started with Scott Hall, and like one of the most iconic debuts in, wrestling history. Scott Hall came out of the crowd, jumps into the ring during a match and says, you know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. And it sets the wrestling world on fire because everybody thinks like, oh my God, Vince McMahon is sending people to WCW. It's going to be an invasion. Like this is, oh my God, like it just like it's huge. And then 2 weeks later, Kevin Nash shows up. And at this point, now WWE, that's when they start taking a beating. They start taking a beating. And, but the funny thing about it, that's when they do the whole thing with Eric Bischoff, where, you get your three guys and, us and our mystery buddy will challenge you. But the funny thing about it is Eric Bischoff says, we're making all of this. We have no idea who the third man is going to be. So he approaches Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan initially turns it down because, at this point, what you have to remember is all the kids that grew up on the 80s on Hulk Hogan, and not just Hulk Hogan, but he's the poster child for the 80s. And a lot of the kids, though, that were, grew up on the saying your prayers, taking your vitamins, training. Well, those 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, they're older now. And it's kind of wearing thin. And even if you watch a lot of Hogan's matches in WCW prior to turning, you kind of hear the crowd, maybe not really booing him, but not like the pops he would get, prior.
Yeah, they were getting tired of it. You could sense it in the crowd.
And they even kind of tried to turn him heel at the end of 95. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. It's something I didn't even know until recently, but they did like a Dark Side Hogan, something of that nature. And he actually had the black trunks and the black bandana, and they did the beard on him. And it didn't really go over well. So I think that's probably why he decided, I'm not going to do that. We tried that already. It didn't really work.
Well, so even
I don't remember that because you know what? I got to tell you guys, like, this is where I kind of stopped watching wrestling for a little bit. I got sick of it at this point, and it was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash that brought me back when the NWO starts. This is what brought me back into wrestling.
Well, the thing with it, Hogan, though, also felt, Hogan was the original John Cena, not just with his moves, though, but with, like, he did a lot of stuff for Make-A-Wish, a lot of stuff with, like, sick children.
Oh, sure.
And he said to Bischoff, he made the comment, he goes, brother, until you walk a mile in the red and yellow boots, you never know the responsibility that comes with it. Because he felt like he said in the one interview I saw, he said, I had kids that came up to me. Hey, I grew up without a dad. And I, like you like were somebody a role model I could look up to. And so he felt a lot of like, responsibility to the kids. But at the same time, though, don't make no mistake about it, he was still making a lot of money in merchandising. So, and it's like, he knew that, like, hey, if this goes south, it's not something that I could just, okay, I'm going back to the red and yellow a month later. Once you go down this road where they were going with the NWO, there's no coming back from that anytime soon. So he turns it down. So Bischoff is going to go with Sting. Sting was going to be the third guy. Now, if you talk to Bret Hart, because that's when Eric was trying to sign Bret Hart. Bret Hart claims he was going to be the third guy, which Eric Bischoff denies to this day. He said, I never had any intention. Bret says that he was supposed to be the third guy, so take it for what you will. But Hogan starts seeing like the promos with Nash and Hall, and he sees dollar signs. And he goes to Bischoff after the fact. He goes, okay, so He goes, yeah, the third guy, he agrees to do it. But the hilarious thing about it, because Hogan had creative control on all of his contract about where his character was going, nobody believed him. Hall, Nash, and Bischoff, no, they did not think he was going to do it. Literally, the day of Bash at the Beach, 5:30, Hogan's still not at the building. They don't know if he's going to do it or not. And Eric Bischoff says, okay, well, if he backs out, Sting, we're going back with you. And then, Hogan shows up at the building and the NWO was born. Which at that point,
that really kicked off the Monday Night Wars. That really started it, Ange. I mean, that, I don't know if it started right away, but WCW had like an 83-week run where they were winning.
Oh my God, it was brutal.
Every single
It was brutal.
Week. And Vince was thinking he was going to go out of business. I mean, it was bad. It was a real tough period. I mean, this is where I started watching again because Sean and Jamie kind of brought me back into the.
Well, Kevin Nash said, it was either Kevin Nash or Hulk Hogan said that Vince told him he was about 3 or 4 weeks from closing the doors.
And I think he at some point had to take a loan in order to meet payroll. Like things were just going well. And we talked about this when Sean and I did the episode about the Montreal screw job. He was really suffering financially. He just couldn't keep it afloat.
But you know what I always say the first shot of the Monday Night War was? If you remember this, the first shot in the Monday Night War, I always thought was the debut episode of Monday Nitro. And you got to believe somebody lost their job on this one. Lex Luger, who was wrestling in WWE, I think, because the thing with Vince McMahon, Vince McMahon has always been trying to find the next Hulk Hogan. First, it was the Ultimate Warrior. Ultimate Warrior, as much as I love the guy and was a fan of his, he was a head case. That didn't work out. Then he brought in Sid Vicious under the moniker of Sid Justice. That didn't work out. Then he brought in Lex Luger. Initially was the narcissist, but then put him in the red, white, and blue Patriot thing. And Lex Luger hated that. He didn't feel comfortable with like the whole thing, like they sent him on that bus tour. He didn't feel comfortable in that with the fans. He didn't feel comfortable with the character. He hated it. And his contract was up. And I don't know and Lex Luger said they forgot about it.
Right.
So, I mean, I don't know if they figured, okay, he'll just work on a gentleman's agreement until we get something done.
What happens with those deals, Ange, is that they would roll over. So if they didn't negotiate a new deal, which the contract would just roll over and be basically the same deal for the next year. And I think that's what Vince assumed Lex was going to do. And he didn't. He jumped ship. He signed with WCW, didn't tell anybody in WWF.
Yeah. Well, that's Sean Waltman was telling that. He goes, Sean Waltman was like, I got to travel with him that weekend. I was traveling on house shows. I was with him Saturday and Sunday. We turned the TV on Monday and he shows up on Monday Night Raw on Monday Night Nitro.
Yeah.
But Lex Luger said he contacted Eric Bischoff. He said, hey, my contract's up. They don't know. But the funny thing, even with that, Eric Bischoff did not want to sign Lex Luger. He hated Lex Luger. Didn't like him, didn't want him. But Lex Luger went through Sting, and Sting approached Eric Bischoff, and Eric Bischoff said, he goes, I don't want to sign him, but I gotta save face with Sting. So Eric Bischoff goes, I'm just going to give him a really low ball offer where I know he's going to refuse it. And this way here, I can say, well, I offered him a contract, but he turned it down. But to his surprise, Lex Luger took it.
Yeah.
So Lex Luger says to him, hey, I'm not under contract anymore. They forgot about me.
Right.
So he had him show up at the Mall of America on the debut episode of Monday Night Nitro.
Right.
And I really feel that was the first shot, because that's why I don't think you'll ever see Lex Luger in the WWE with that whole thing. I don't think you'll ever, because I don't think he made him very endeared to anybody, especially Vince McMahon, because I think that was the first shot. And that's where, like I said, Monday Nitro really, because that really, once again, everybody was, oh my God, I'm like, Lex Luger showed up.
Yeah.
I just saw him yesterday wrestling for WWE.
Right. So let's get back to I think now at this point, we're late 97, early 98, and WCW, Nitro is just dominating. Right. And It really,
and it's because of the NWO, really.
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and the one group of individuals I think that never got the recognition from either side, because both will deny, oh no, we didn't copy off of them. I think really ECW though really changed the landscape of professional wrestling. Because if you remember, prior to ECW, it was very family friendly orientated, like a very family orientated product, not really risky or anything like that, not a lot of violence on TV, and ECW comes out, even like the female talent, like female wrestlers were basically, it was like a sideshow attraction. They were very conservatively dressed, or you'd be like a valet like Miss Elizabeth for Randy Savage. But I mean, ECW comes out, the matches are more violent. It's a lot more adult themed storylines geared towards adults. The women were like dressed like porn stars, and they had a lot of specialty matches. They also had a big focus on the cruiserweights, the lucha libre wrestlers, as well as the Japanese wrestlers. And I think while WCW, it was, the ECW was never going to get a primetime show with their programming and how it was done. I mean, they'd never get the promotion or the commercials or the advertising. They'd be in hot water with the network every week. But I think both groups looked at it and said, well, look, we don't have to go to that extreme, no pun intended, but at the same time, though, we could take stuff from that, and because that, you look at the NWO, that's really more like, it's almost like a gangster thuggish type group, more adult story. I remember more violent, like when they launched Rey Mysterio like a lawn dart into the side of a trailer. And even they focused a lot on the cruiserweights, wrestlers like Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, like the Mexican wrestlers like Conan and Rey Mysterio.
Yeah, ECW definitely had an impact on both companies. In fact, I think, WWF actually formed an agreement with ECW where they would run some of their talent on WWF programs, right? And they kind of got, that's kind of how they started getting back into back into the game again. They kind of took that attitude from ECW and incorporated it into their main programming. And I think that's basically what launched Stone Cold Steve Austin. And
and the thing is this, like Shawn Michaels and Triple H, like the Clique, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, prior to them leaving, went to Vince McMahon and said, look, we got to change things up. This whole, like the way this family friendly, or it's getting stale. And Vince McMahon kind of blows them off and says, I get what you're saying, but now's not the time. Well, by the time he realized it was the time, like he's getting shellacked every week in the ratings. But it's like, he also realizes though, is that Vince McMahon realizes that, and there's no bigger proof of this when Stone Cold wrestles Bret Hart at WrestleMania. I mean, Stone Cold really did nothing to endear himself as somebody the fans should be cheering for. But you watch that match, he goes in getting booed. By the end of the match, he's getting cheered and Bret Hart's getting booed. So he realizes that, the landscape has changed. And like you said, Bill, it's like he really starts, Stone Cold really starts to take off. That's when DX makes their debut, with Shawn Michaels and Triple H. And then they really start to gear at that more adult themed storylines and getting away from just aiming at the kids. Mm-hmm. And also the other thing that really helped them was because Vince McMahon, I've heard this numerous times, does not like or appreciate tag team wrestling. But one of the big things also that helped them was the tag teams like the Dudleys, Edge and Christian, the Hardy Boys, APA, those tables, ladders, and chair matches they would have. A lot of people thought they were better than the main events of WrestleMania. Right. That really helped them. And then also wrestlers like Mick Foley, that, it really helped them.
Yeah. Well, there were three things, Ange, that really turned it around for WWF. One was obviously Stone Cold. We talked about that. The other one was The Rock, and The Rock
Yeah.
started, gaining in popularity. He really turned into the character that, that made him famous. And then the other one was one we talked about when we talked about the Montreal Screwjob, was Mr. McMahon. And Mr. McMahon became the ultimate heel. And that's really what launched this whole Attitude Era. And that's when the eyes started moving from Nitro to Raw, and people wanted to see what's going to happen with Raw, what's going to happen with McMahon and Stone Cold, what's The Rock going to say, scantily clad women are going to be on. Although I don't think that had as much to do with it as those three things. But, and like you said, the tables, ladders, and chairs, which would come a little bit later. But yeah, absolutely. Those, I think, and those are the three things that really turned it around. And on top of that, WCW couldn't get out of its own way. They didn't know what to do with Bret Hart. The NWO had kind of reached the end of their storyline. They didn't know what to do with Sting anymore. It just became, a kind of a shit show over there. And
I think part of the problem with WCW though was, and with Eric, like, you had a lot, especially after the Time Warner merger, you had a lot of people with their hands in the business side of things, cookie jar, that had no knowledge of the wrestling business, didn't care about the wrestling business, and to be honest, probably didn't care one way or the other if it sank or swam.
Right. They didn't want it. To them, it was an albatross. They didn't want the company.
I mean, because
Eric Bischoff has said many times he was trying to compete with Vince basically with two hands tied behind his back, because Vince could do whatever the heck he wanted, and Eric had to run everything by corporate. And it got ridiculous after a while. He couldn't do anything he wanted to do.
And like, there was a lot of chaos backstage where, I mean, like, the thing, and that's what I think helped WWE, because like, in the difference between the two, if WCW goes under, Eric Bischoff gets another job somewhere else. Like, the wrestlers, okay, they can go somewhere. Like, you know what I mean? They don't really, I mean, Eric Bischoff doesn't want it to, but like the business people, like I said, they don't care if it sinks or swim. Where with Vince McMahon, this is his livelihood. There is no plan B.
Right.
I mean, and like, so, I mean, it's something my mother used to say, like, there's nothing more dangerous than somebody that's cornered with nothing to lose. And, that's the difference. But I mean, like, Chris Jericho used to say, we be going out, literally walking through the curtain. We had no idea what the finish was. Like, he was with WWE. I mean, everything is organized. You know what you're doing when you're out there, what's going to happen. Eric Bischoff said, he goes, Vince McMahon I was told Vince McMahon knows the storyline a year before it's supposed to end. And with the WCW, like I said, you had a lot. I mean, a really funny story Eric Bischoff said, if you remember when he fired Randy Pee Wee Anderson on TV in front of his family, they said that Randy Anderson's hometown called up Time Warner and were livid. They were just lighting up the phone lines. He's a disgrace. We're never watching your show again. I'm pulling the advertising. Human Resources calls Harvey Schiller. They're going berserk. What's wrong with him? What's he doing? Oh my God, we're going to get sued. He can't fire somebody on national TV. What the hell's he thinking? Get him out of here. And Eric Bischoff goes, they thought it was real. And here, Randy Anderson had cancer and he was getting pulled off of television because he's going for cancer treatments. But the business side of things doesn't know their product is scripted.
Right. The way I kind of describe it, Ange, is WCW was a television show featuring wrestling, and the WWF was a wrestling event with cameras there. Like, you really felt when you were watching that on TV that you were there, you were in the arena. Like, there was just stuff going on, and it didn't matter if there were cameras there or not. It was just, they were putting on an amazing show. To me, that was the big difference. I mean, it was a wrestling company that knew what they were doing. Like you said, I mean, the difference between the two companies, and all the wrestlers say the same thing. It's like apples and bowling balls. They'd go from one company to they'd go from WCW, WWF, and all of a sudden, there was someone in charge of creative, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Like you said, when they would go to the ring, they'd have stories that were worked out ahead of time. In WCW, they were basically making it up on the fly. Bischoff said there were nitros where he didn't know what was gonna, he had no idea what was going to be on that.
Well,
he would just put it together.
And the other thing also is, like, when Eric Bischoff gets, I don't know, like, basically put on the shelf, or I don't know if he was fired or not, but he got put on the shelf. They bring in Vince Russo, who I think inflated his importance to Vince McMahon a little bit to help him get the job. But like his thing was ridiculous. I mean, like, it just went from one like extreme to 1 minute. Okay, all of a sudden Sting's popular. Nope, no, he's a bad guy. Nope, no, he's popular again. Nope, no, Goldberg. Then like, it was crazy. And then he put the world heavyweight, your number one title, you put on David Arquette.
Right.
And then I think at one point Vince Russo won the title.
Yeah, terrible.
And then
it was just
he ended up giving, like, saying, "Oh, I'm not a wrestler. So I'm going to vacate the title."
Were just throwing anything against the wall to see if
exactly.
For me, the thing is, what brought me back it was the NWO, and at that point, it's just the NWO. They had a storyline, but they didn't have a way to end it, and it just got so ridiculous. And I think when they start bringing in so many guys, like, they should have kept it to what we considered as the WWF guys taking over the WCW. And they should have kept it to those guys instead of bringing in all these other guys. And I think just
when you've got Horace Hogan and Virgil and all these guys who are now in the NWO, that's kind of a signal that.
Bill, I don't know if you remember, but me, you, and I think my brother, we were watching the one pay-per-view when Scott Hall turned on Kevin Nash. Yeah. And I just remember that. I remember saying, I don't know if I said it out loud, but I remember thinking this is the beginning of the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once they split them guys up, that was it.
Yeah, they didn't know what to do with it. They had a plan, I think, through Starrcade 97. After that, they had no idea what to do with it.
And I think Goldberg saved them a little bit. Goldberg got real popular.
He did, but I think what they did with Goldberg was they pushed him too quick, obviously. And
they rushed him.
It ended up backfiring on them as well. They just couldn't get out of their own way. They didn't know what to do with the guys that they had. And, again, Bret Hart
didn't fit.
Bret Hart didn't fit. They didn't know what to do with him. This was one of the, most well-known, most popular, most talented guys on the planet. And they had no idea. There were weeks where, we talked about this, Sean. There were weeks where he'd show up for TV and they'd send him home because they didn't have it before. That's ridiculous. So,
Bill, you bring up a good point, even with the Starrcade match, though. They talk about it in that the NWO biography show. A really funny story with that is they built up that storyline so good for 1 year, and Starrcade was going to be the payoff,
right?
And then. And this is, I think, the other thing that hurt when you have wrestlers with creative control. They have Sting is going to go over that night. He's going to get the belt. Hogan shows up that night at the pay-per-view and he goes, "Nope, I'm not feeling it tonight."
Right.
Nope. And he refused. So then they got to come up with that. If you remember, it was like they talk about it in the show. It was supposed to be a screwball finish where Nick Patrick does a fast count and Sting kicks out at the last minute where it's supposed to lead to another match. Well, there's two problems with that. Number one, Nick Patrick didn't do a fast count. Number two, Sting never kicks out. So it looks like he pinned him cleanly. And then to make matters worse, they send Bret Hart, who's supposed to be the special enforcer, comes down saying, "Oh, it's a fast count," knocks out Nick Patrick and restarts the match. And Sting, of course, wins. Kevin Nash says, "I'm watching it on the back in the monitor, and it was like watching the Hindenburg go down."
Yeah. Well, I remember watching that with you, Sean, and we were confused. We were like, "What's going on here? What are they doing?
What the heck?"
But the funny, like, Sting, like Hogan says, Sting was supposed to kick out. It was supposed to be a fast count, and Sting is like, "Well, I don't know. I guess I don't know how there could be confusion, though, because you're supposed to kick out before as he's hitting 3. And, I don't, maybe Sting was ticked off that like Hogan backed out. So he's like, you know what? I'm going to take liberties and I'm not going to kick out. I don't know, but I remember Kevin Nash saying, he goes, watching it was like watching the Hindenburg go down. Yeah. It was like ridiculous.
Well, and then, WCW would continue that on that trajectory. And eventually they did go down. And then what was it? 2001, McMahon ends up buying them.
I think that was really sad. Because like I said, part of me, like I consider myself a WWE guy because that's what I grew up on. But right. I was always a fan of wrestling as a whole, especially, like the NWA, WCW, because to me, like the matches they did and like it was like more of a serious like product. Like it was just like it was something I really enjoyed all together. And seeing that go down when you only have one big game in town, it's not good for anybody because you don't have any competition. There's nobody to keep you honest where you're putting out your best product. Exactly. And I think that was really bad. And I think down deep, even Vince McMahon himself needed competition because that's where, okay, I don't have competition. I'm going to make competition. And that's when he started doing the whole brand split, which he does off and on to this day, which I still think is ridiculous all these years later, but he needed that competition. But I think one thing also that hurt WCW, though, is say what you want about Vince McMahon. He's a lot of things, most not nice. But the one thing he's always been able to do is develop new talent and build up talent. Yeah. You look at like Chris Jericho and Benoit and Cena, like Batista, Randy Orton, John Cena.
Definitely.
Like the thing that hurt WCW is, with the exception of Goldberg and DDP, and towards the end, I guess you could say Booker T and Scott Steiner, but they never really got the chance to really become that main event player. They really were never able to develop new talent to create new matches because you could only have Hogan wrestle Sting or Goldberg or Flair or Sting or Luke. You could only have that so many times before it starts getting wear and thin. But when you have wrestlers that don't want to, like with creative control, and I'm not going to drop the belt to him, or I don't want to. He's beneath me. I don't want to. I think they wanted Hogan to wrestle. Was it Rey Mysterio or I can't remember who it was. Hogan flat out refused. Didn't want to wrestle him, and I said, nope, I'm not doing it.
Yeah,
and one of the things you always hear wrestlers like, Bret Hart, like, and Stone Cold credits him to this day. And same thing with DDP with Randy Savage. Randy Savage and Bret Hart put over DDP and Stone Cold. You put them over to the point where they became automatic bona fide main event players. But when you have like somebody like, and I'm not just throwing Hogan under the bus here because like you heard this a lot about, Kevin Nash. Oh, I never had creative control. Other wrestlers. Oh, yes, he did. But when you have wrestlers that basically are not wanting to do business, like to keep their spot in like the famous Arn Anderson quote, keep my spot, it hurts business because you need new talent. You can't keep rehashing the same matches over and over and over again. It's just, It's not going to work.
And I think, Andrew, what Vince understood was fans were more interested and you could keep their attention with the pursuit of the babyface getting the championship. It was more of, I want to see this guy win, so I'm going to keep tuning in until that happens. And, that's really what did it for them, because it seemed like Stone Cold was always trying to, he was always trying to get over on McMahon, or, The Rock was always trying. And that's where he knew how to do it, and WCW didn't know how to do it. And that's why he ended up.
It comes down to what Ann said earlier, though. This is Vince McMahon's life. And that
exactly.
was, he understood the business better than anybody. He grew up with it. And these guys, were just businessmen over at WCW.
Yep.
And they're just trying to run a business that they have no understanding of. And, I'm an old school wrestling fan. Like I grew up just like Ann's and you too, Billy, like WWF. I grew up in that, but I liked all of it. Like I watched the old NWA, I watched the AWA, Southwest Wrestling.
I did too. Yep.
Yeah.
All of that stuff, But the thing is, whether you like him or you don't like him, Vince McMahon is a genius in that business.
He is.
And he knows how to do the wrestling business.
Yeah.
Even WCW, when given a golden opportunity, think about this one. Even when given a golden opportunity, they fumbled the ball. Remember when DX did the whole invasion of Monday Nitro and they came with the Jeep and they came up to the, like literally up to the garage door. Kevin Nash tells this story. He's like, they drove up there, they're banging on the doors, like free hauling Nash, hello, let us in. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were on the other side of the garage door. And they were begging security to open the door.
You can't blame Bischoff for that though, because he didn't know it was on his television.
But could you imagine though?
He didn't know what was going to happen. He couldn't do that. I mean, so anyway, I think, Ange, we got to wrap this up because, we're already over an hour here, but we can go on forever talking about this stuff. But I think, the bottom line is it was good for wrestling because it brought back.
Yeah.
After, and I think all of us,
you'll never see anything like that again.
Never.
Was truly the golden era of wrestling.
But you know what? I want to leave you guys with a quote that I think sums it all up. When Ted Turner decided to get into WCW and buy it, or he said to Vince McMahon, he called him up and he said, "I've decided to get into the wrestling business." And Vince said to him, "Well, that's good because I'm in the entertainment business."
That's right. That's right.
And that's the difference. Ted Turner, worked for a while. They had the great thing run with the NWO, but Vince, he understood the business better than anybody, and that's why he won in the long run.
Exactly. He knew how to keep his audience. He knew how to build an audience and keep them, and WCW didn't. And that's the bottom line. No, but seriously, I mean, that's why Vince is still the wrestling king today. I mean, how many years later, 20 some years later, he's still the guy. And until he decides to give it up. And I know he's sold recently. They sold WWE, but he's still going to remain, in control of it. And why not? I mean, when you got a genius like that, why not let him run the company?
He's a podcast we could have all together, everything that he's going through as of late.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, Ange, thank you, man. We thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on,
buddy.
guys.
This was awesome.
Love the show.
Yeah, thank you for coming on with us and being a Patreon. We really appreciate it. And I would just encourage everybody go check out our website. Go check out, Patreon. It's what is it, Sean? $2 gets you in the door.
You can get in with $1.
$1.
Whatever you want, you get in.
Get you in the door.
I saw the thing the other day. You guys saying trying to get Robert Kennedy Jr. or Sammy the Bull. I'd love to see both of them on that.
We'd love to have
we're always working on guests, Dan. It never stops, buddy, and we're reaching out to
both of them.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, that was a great show. Really appreciate it again, Ange, coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, you want to talk us out, Ange? You want to say the line?
That's enough out of you.
All right.
Outstanding, Big Ange. We'll see you, buddy.
Good night,
Take
everybody.
care.
Good night, everybody.